He never expected a letter to save his life. 20 years ago, Peter was 26, lost to addiction, locked behind the cold walls of a Pennsylvania prison, and certain the world had already given up on him. Most days he barely spoke. He'd sit on his bunk, staring at the same cinderblock wall, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Then one afternoon, during mail call, a guard dropped a plain white envelope on his bed. The handwriting was neat, steady, and gentle, a little old-fashioned. Peter almost threw it away. But the first line made him pause. "Dear Peter, I don't know your story, but I'd like to listen." It was signed simply, "Yours truly, Bob." Bob was retired, living alone in a small Pennsylvania town called Steelton. He'd signed up for a volunteer program that paired people in prison with pen pals, people who just needed a kind word. But Bob wasn't like the others. He didn't offer advice. He didn't ask about Peter's crimes. He wrote about his garden, the tomatoes he couldn't stop overwatering, the stray cat that kept stealing his breakfast, the smell of rain on old wood. And between all that, he asked gentle questions. What kind of music do you like? Have you ever seen the ocean? What's the first meal you'd want when you got out? For the first time in years, Peter felt like a human being again. Someone saw him, not the inmate, not the addict, but the person underneath it all. He started writing back. At first, the letters were short, cautious, uncertain. But as the weeks turned into months, Peter found himself waiting for mail call like a child waiting for Christmas. Each new letter brought a piece of the outside world. A story, a memory, a joke, a quiet reassurance that someone cared enough to write. And slowly what started as small talk became something deeper. Bob shared memories of his late wife, the silence of his empty house, the books he loved to read aloud when no one was there to hear. Peter shared things he'd never told anyone, his fears, his regrets, the dreams he barely remembered. Neither of them realized it yet, but that first letter, that simple act of kindness, was the beginning of a love story that would last a lifetime. Years passed. Every letter, every carefully chosen word, became a thread connecting two very different lives. Peter's life in prison was still hard. The walls were cold, the days long, and the nights even longer. But Bob's letters offered him a small escape. Sometimes, Peter read them over and over, memorizing the little details, the way Bob described the smell of fresh rain, or the cat that sat on his windowsill, waiting for scraps. They laughed together through letters. Bob sent little sketches, doodles of the garden or the cat, which made Peter smile like he hadn't in years. Peter began to write longer letters, sharing his love for music, the dreams he hoped to chase once he was free, and even the tiny victories he had each day. A day without using, a book read, a conversation survived. Over time, the letters became their lifeline. They talked about everything and nothing, filling the silence of prison and the quiet of Bob's empty house alike. And though they'd never met face to face, Peter began to feel something he hadn't expected, a deep, unwavering connection. Through pen and ink, they had built a world where Peter felt seen, understood, and slowly loved. One evening, Peter read Bob's latest letter aloud to himself. "Bob, I saw a robin in my garden today. It looked so proud, like it owned the world. Made me think, maybe you can feel proud too, even in there." Peter, writing back, "I smiled at that, Bob. It's silly, but for a moment I felt outside these walls." Bob, "Not silly at all. The world waits for you, Peter. One day you'll see it again." Peter, "I hope so. I really hope so." They continued this quiet exchange through letters, each one stretching across the miles, each one carrying hope, each one deepening a bond neither had anticipated. 10 years passed before they finally met in person. Peter had been out of prison for 3 months. He was learning to live on the outside, staying clean, finding work, and discovering who he was without fear. But every week, just like before, he wrote to Bob. And every week, without fail, a letter arrived, filled with warmth, humor, and quiet wisdom that had carried him through the darkest years of his life. Then one day Bob wrote something different. "I think it's time we meet if you're ready." Peter hesitated. He'd imagined this day countless times. The man behind the letters, the voice that had guided him, the friend who had saved his life. Would it be awkward? Would Bob be disappointed? But when an old blue sedan pulled up outside the diner in Steelton, all of Peter's nerves melted away. Bob stepped out slowly, his hair mostly gray, his soft smile exactly as Peter had pictured it for years. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two men from different worlds, bound together by 20 years of letters. Then Bob opened his arms. No words. Just a hug. And in that moment, Peter knew this wasn't just friendship. It was something far deeper. They spent hours in that diner, laughing like old friends, talking about gardens, recovery, and dreams that had survived decades. At one point, Bob reached across the table. You know, I never thought my letters meant that much. Peter's eyes filled with tears. Bob, they saved my life. Bob smiled. No, Peter. You saved your own life. I just reminded you it was worth living. After their first hug, Peter and Bob slid into the booth at the diner. The air smelled of coffee and fresh pie, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Bob chuckled softly. Did I match the man in your imagination? Peter laughed, a little embarrassed. Almost. I think I imagined you taller. Bob raised an eyebrow. Taller? I'll take that as a compliment. Peter smiled, shaking his head. And somehow, even warmer. I didn't know smiles could carry so much weight. Bob reached across the table, lightly brushing Peter's hand. I guess letters are heavy with feelings we never say aloud. Peter nodded, looking down at their hands, then back up at him. Then let's make sure the next 20 years of talking isn't just on paper. Bob's eyes twinkled. I'd like that very much. You've changed my life, Peter. You know that, right? Peter's chest tightened. And you've changed mine, Bob. Every letter, every word, it kept me alive when I didn't think I could be. Bob smiled softly. Well then, we have a lot of catching up to do. Over the next 10 years, their friendship quietly became love. Peter moved into a small apartment not far from Bob's house. They met every Sunday morning at the diner, same booth, same coffee, same slice of apple pie. Bob told stories about his neighbors, the weather, the birds that stole seeds from his feeder. Peter listened, smiling, feeling lighter simply by being near him. They never called it love at first. But it was in the small things. Bob reaching for Peter's hand during storms, Peter mowing Bob's lawn every summer, quiet evenings on the porch where nothing needed to be said. Peter wanted to say, I love you, but he feared Bob might hesitate. So instead, he showed it, by being present, by cooking, by driving him to appointments, by never letting Bob be alone on birthdays. One night, under fireflies, Bob finally spoke. Peter, you've given me more peace than I ever thought I'd find in this life. Peter smiled softly. You did the same for me, Bob. Long before we even met. Bob chuckled. Guess we saved each other then. From that night on, silence was no longer awkward. It was love, quiet, loyal, and real. Built on letters, laughter, and ordinary moments that made life worth living. The years passed, and life settled into a rhythm of small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because they shared them together. One rainy afternoon, they sat on the porch, feet resting on the wooden railing, listening to the steady patter of rain on the roof. Bob handed Peter a warm mug of coffee. You know, Bob said, I never thought I'd find someone who could make silence feel full. Peter smiled, wrapping his hands around the mug. Neither did I. It's strange, isn't it? How comfort can come from just being near someone. Bob's eyes softened. You make every day lighter. Even when the world seems heavy, you make it bearable. Peter reached across and gently squeezed Bob's hand. And you've given me a life I didn't think I deserved. Every letter, every word, it all led me here. To you. Bob chuckled, though a tear glimmered in his eye. Guess we really did save each other, didn't we? Peter laughed softly. Yeah, we really did. They sat in quiet for a while, watching the rain blur the world around them, holding hands without needing to speak. It was in these simple moments, shared coffee, soft laughter, the touch of hands, that their love revealed itself most clearly. No grand gestures. No declarations. Just two hearts, intertwined, living quietly, faithfully, and completely for each other. Years passed and Bob grew older. Peter became his anchor, and their life together was filled with simple joys. Morning coffee, evening walks, holding hands on the porch. In 2025, Bob became ill. Peter stayed by his side, reading to him, holding him, reminding him of the life they had shared. The letters, the laughter, the love that had grown quietly over decades. On his last night, Bob whispered, Peter, you made my life worth living. Tears filled Peter's eyes. And you made mine, he replied. Every single day. Bob smiled one last time, peaceful, and then he was gone. Peter mourned, but he carried Bob with him. In memories of laughter, in warmth of their hands intertwined, in the love that endured. Sitting in their favorite diner the next morning, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise, Peter understood. Love like theirs doesn't end with a life. It lives on, in letters, in quiet moments, and in the heart of the person who was loved completely for a lifetime. Sometimes, the people who save us are the ones we never expect. Sometimes they are the ones we love forever.